Firstly tonight, the Sunday Times has learned that a ban on Chinese-owned social media app TikTok from all government electronic devices is to be recommended after the security review raised concerns about the safety of sensitive data. An initial review was done by the Government Security Group, which is a cabinet committee. However, more recently, it's understood that experts at GCHQ's National Cybersecurity Centre assessed the app and identified risks to sensitive information. Well, owned by Chinese company ByteDance, TikTok has long maintained that it doesn't hold data in China or share it with Beijing. Well, let's speak to Ellen Judson now, who is the head of the Centre of the Analysis of Social Media. Hello, Ellen. And Emily Taylor, who is the CEO of Oxford Information Labs and an expert in international security. Emily, hello there.
Hello there.
Thank you both for being with us. Really appreciate it. Ellen, let me start with you. Why, as we understand it, is TikTok a risk?
So I think, seeing the pattern across the world at the moment, the UK is very much not on its own in these worries about TikTok and the security of it and the privacy implications of using it. I think the worries at the moment seem to really be focusing around what data TikTok is collecting and what it's sharing and who it's sharing it with particular concerns about if it might be sharing data or be compelled to share data with the Chinese government. And I think that's where a lot of these national security concerns have been coming from.
Okay.
But I think...
Yeah, go on. Sorry, go on.
Well, I just think what's interesting is that this isn't a kind of new worry. Worries about what data social media platforms are collecting and who they're sharing it with have been around for as long as social media. So I think it's interesting that this is being portrayed as a very new risk when actually I think this is a kind of continuation of a lot of the challenges we've been having over the last few years.
Yeah. Okay, Emily, help us answer some of those questions then. So let's start with the first one that Ellen poses. What is it collecting? What is their suggestion that TikTok is collecting data-wise?
Well, if you look at TikTok's privacy policy or privacy policy, if you want to succumb to Americanisms, Daryl, it's over 5,000 words long. And actually, as Ellen says, it's very familiar reading to anyone who's looked at the privacy policies of other free-to-use platforms. In fact, it spells it out in great detail, and in terms of the GDPR, the privacy laws that affect us all. But it's actually more easy to think about things that aren't collected by all social media platforms that have the same business model, which is to track and understand users' behavior and their preferences and put them in front of advertising that they're likely to find attractive. And sure enough, you see all of the usual things, about location, IP address, the content you view, the duration and frequency of your use, engagement with other users. We could go on and on and on. And while TikTok has been doing a lot and particularly upped its game in the last week to try to convince European audiences and regulators that it should be trusted, I think we should understand this in the context of increasing geopolitical tensions between China and the West, growing mistrust over Ukraine, Taiwan, the spy balloon, and learning from Huawei, where we had very similar rhetoric on both sides. Technology is often the lightning rod for those tensions, and efforts to build confidence by the companies and dispel anxieties, even where there's a sort of lack of a smoking gun, if you like. I think there's that there has been some incidents which TikTok says are just bad behavior by employees who've been fired, but there isn't the same or any smoking gun. What it is just that undercurrent of mistrust, and what we learn from Huawei is it's very, very difficult for companies to really counter that, because it's all about the context. If you have the Chinese national security laws, grave concerns over human rights, repression, and lack of rule of law restraints on the government, then suddenly all of those practices that are common among US counterparts as well, they seem so much more sinister when you fear that the data might be shared with the Chinese government.
Right. Okay. So just to clarify, then, it's not necessarily about what the data that they're collecting, because they perhaps don't collect any more data than my Facebook app would, or my Instagram, or whatever, another social media app. It's about the links to China, you say, Emily, and the potential for that data to be handed on to Beijing. That's the key thing.
Well, I'd probably argue with your first assumption, though, Daryl, because I think that, as Ellen says, that this business model that relies on such intrusive collection and pervasive collection of data is a concern to, it's a democratic concern, it's a concern for basic human rights. And it's particularly acute where you have a context like China, where there are laws compelling companies to share data with government, the Chinese government. We've seen a recent crackdown by China on very powerful tech companies, including Alibaba, and also very poor protection of human rights and, real concerns about repression.
Okay. Yeah, fair point. Ellen, there are other examples, aren't there, of apps that are obviously just away from the sort of general point about data collection from social media apps and the wider issues that Emily points to around that. Apps like I'm trying to remember the name. There was some sort of face swap app, wasn't there, that everybody used and everybody loved, and then there were some really serious question marks about who owned that app and what the data that app was harvesting was going to. So we have seen examples of this kind of thing before.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it really points to the kind of lack of transparency, both to users who are interacting with the app. Emily mentioned the length and complexity of the privacy policy is as kind of standard, so that people aren't really always clear on what, as you say, what the app ownership is or what data is being collected. But I think there's a broader point as well around what that means in terms of when we're thinking as a government, as a society, what do we do about these issues, needing to think beyond the short term of, okay, this app is too risky, or this technology looks too risky, maybe we just need to stop people using it immediately. Looking towards the more longer term solution of, okay, how can we come up with frameworks for transparency, frameworks for auditing what exactly companies are doing, auditing their internal policies, their internal processes, to be able to give that kind of either reassurance and clarity where actually there may not be mispractice, but also to highlight where there might be issues or non-compliance. And I think really moving away from this kind of reactive, wait for a problem to arise and then panic when we don't quite know what's going on and we don't really know what the sort of safest solution is. We need to be thinking more long-term and strategically. Right,
that's interesting. I must confess, I made a documentary about a similar issue, about dark patterns, which is sort of malicious web design, and the way that some websites design themselves to sort of do things that are good for them and bad for you. And, so there's a grey area legally. Some of them cross a line, some of them don't. There's lots of ethical questions. One of the things that really struck me, Emily, in the making of the documentary is just how far ahead of the curve Silicon Valley is on legislators. That legislators in Europe, America, anywhere really, frankly, around the world, trying to keep up with the speed at which social media sites, firms, tech companies are able to innovate, change, dodge regulation, adapt to regulation, is just extraordinary. There's just no chance of regulators being able to keep up with the pace of them.
I think it's generally true that technology moves much faster than regulation, and the general knowledge among regulators and particularly politicians has been lower than it should be. I do think that's evolving though, because if you think back to even 5-10 years ago, there really was this attitude, you can't regulate the internet. And I think it's really difficult to regulate technology, really difficult. But regulators are now trying. They're getting it wrong a lot of the time. But when you look at the papers, that particularly that come out of the European Union and the analysis that comes out of the British government, you mentioned the National Cyber Security Centre, they always put out really good stuff. There is actually a very good level of understanding among officials particularly. So I think that evolution is happening, but it also comes down to resources as well. governments typically don't have the same resources as a lot of these tech companies. And just one more point, to throw into the mix, I think that often national security is a convenient hook on which to hang economic concerns. There's no doubt that TikTok is an absolute runaway success, particularly among children and young adults, and is eclipsing a lot of the US tech social media platforms in terms of its popularity in the new generations. And I'm sure that that's somewhere in the mix behind these moves.
Wow, really? So you think that part of the thinking, especially as part of America is concerned, that they are concerned about the Chinese market, how well this is doing for the Chinese market?
I think that, and again, I'm sort of learning, maybe overlearning from the Huawei situation, but I think that the anxieties around the US's role and it has always been used to being technically superior. And in 5G, which was the Huawei case, the US doesn't really have a champion, and even on 6G, it's really faltering. And so I think it was in a very uncomfortable situation. And as the US is looking towards China and its rise, its assertiveness, not only politically, but also economically, and through trade and donor relationships with developing countries, it's easy to see why the US in particular is feeling very daunted and defensive about China and technology.
Okay. Just briefly, Ellen, we're also seeing, the Sunday Times article this weekend considers concerns that have been raised about TikTok's addictiveness, particularly for children. I know that's been part of the conversation that the government and security services here have been having. As Emily points out there, it's perhaps a little broader than the specific issues around data. Do you think that that's in play here? Do you think we're sort of starting to have a conversation about what kind of impact these technology platforms are actually, having on the fabric of society, really?
I think that's definitely coming into play in the kind of broader conversations, as Emily said, about regulation and about the need for more oversight of what platforms are doing and the way that they're operating. I think in this particular case, the worries about addictiveness seem to be slightly separate to me in that the proposal is that government officials shouldn't necessarily have TikTok on their work phones, which doesn't really address the kind of broader, necessarily social issues associated with these types of apps. But I think it's interesting that, as Emily said, there are many social media apps. These are very common worries about the addictiveness, about the safety risks, about the various online harms that people are exposed to by using social media platforms. But it's come to a particular head around TikTok rather than perhaps some of the other social media platforms, even though a lot of the potential harms are similar.
Okay, just very, very briefly, Emily, we've talked about the sort of geopolitics a little bit, but what are the prospects of a move like this from the government or from the government security services raising tensions with China?
I think it's part of a general deterioration in the relationships and strains between Beijing and the West. The UK is definitely not out on its own. The EU made a similar announcement for its institutions and officials just a couple of days ago. Belgium, Sweden, Finland, Czech Republic, Estonia, all the same, and other countries are actively monitoring the situation. So I think again, it's the UK is actually in sync here with European Union partners and also the US and Canada, who are all proposing similar bans. As Ellen says, it's for government officials. Let's make that clear. They're not going to be doing too much crazy dancing and lip syncing, I think. Okay. The real user base is much younger.
Okay. Emily, thank you for your time tonight. Emily Taylor, CEO of Oxford Information Labs, and Ellen Judson as well, who's the head of the Centre for the Analysis of Social Media. Really fascinating, that, isn't it? Really interesting to get into the reasons why, the motivations behind that story that we keep hearing time and time again. It just won't go away.